This isn't a story I enjoy telling, but it's one I feel I have to. Some things that happen in the dark need to be brought into the light, and this is mine. The heavy oak doors of Grace Cathedral were closed, but they couldn't muffle the sound of my stepmother's shattered world. I stood at the marble lectern, the crisp, folded pages of my father's last letter trembling in my hand, its words still hanging in the incense-thick air like a death sentence. Below me, in the front pew, Brenda wasn't crying anymore. Her face was a frozen mask of horrified disbelief, her perfectly manicured hands clutching the sleeve of her brother, a man who, just an hour ago, had looked at me with smug pity. They thought they had won. They thought the dead couldn't speak. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. It started, as these things so often do, with a phone call that cleaved my life in two. 1 minute, I was arguing with a vendor about a shipment of ceramics for my small boutique in Hayes Valley. The next, I was on the floor of my stockroom, the world reduced to a tinny voice on the other end of the line telling me my father, Robert Vance, was gone. A massive coronary, they said. Instant. No pain. I didn't believe a word of it. A man with a heart as big as my father's doesn't just let it stop beating. I drove to his Pacific Heights mansion, their mansion, in a daze. The stately Victorian, a place that had once been a warm labyrinth of my childhood memories, now felt alien and cold. Brenda met me at the door. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale, but it was a practiced, almost theatrical grief. She was wearing a black cashmere tracksuit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "Chloe, darling," she'd murmured, pulling me into a hug that felt like being embraced by a bundle of chilled wires. "Our Robert. Gone. Our Robert." The words grated on my soul. He was my dad long before he was her husband. Brenda had entered our lives when I was 16, a whirlwind of social grace, impeccable taste, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Dad, lonely since my mom passed away years earlier, was utterly captivated. She was a curator for a small, exclusive art gallery downtown, and she played the part perfectly. She redecorated the house, hosted his business dinners, and slowly, methodically, insulated him from his old life. Friends he'd had for decades began to drift away. Even my calls sometimes went unanswered, with Brenda later explaining he was terribly swamped or resting. I hated her for it, but I loved my dad and he seemed happy. Or so I told myself. In the days following his death, her grief continued its public performance. There were catered meals from Spruce, endless flower arrangements from luxury florists, and a stream of somber-faced visitors from her social circle. My role in all of this was to be the grieving daughter, a sad little prop for her grand tragedy. I played my part, drifting through the cavernous rooms of my childhood home, feeling like a ghost. But something was wrong. Her sorrow was a brittle veneer, and I could feel the cold, calculating machinery whirring just beneath the surface. The first crack appeared 2 days after he died. I was in his office, a sanctuary of worn leather and the smell of old books, looking for a photo of him and my mom for the memorial service. The door creaked open and Brenda stood there, her arms crossed. "I'd rather you didn't disturb things in here, Chloe. It's all very delicate right now." Her voice was soft, but the order was clear. Before I could respond, she swept in, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk. She walked over to his large mahogany desk, her fingers ghosting over a small, locked drawer on the right-hand side. "Everything needs to be preserved for the estate lawyers," she added, her gaze fixed on that single drawer. "I'll be handling all of it." That night I couldn't sleep. Her obsession with that office, that specific drawer, played on a loop in my mind. My dad was a man of routines and sentiment. He wasn't secretive, but he was private. He wrote letters. For every birthday, every milestone, I'd receive a handwritten letter from him. It was our thing. The idea that he would leave this world without writing one final letter to me was unthinkable. The next morning I asked her directly. We were in the kitchen, the air thick with the cloying scent of lilies. "Brenda," I started, keeping my voice even. Did he leave anything for me? A note? A letter?" She turned from the Nespresso machine, her face a mask of sympathy. "Oh, sweetie. I looked. I looked everywhere. There's nothing. I think it was just too sudden. He didn't have time." She patted my hand, her skin dry and cool. "But he loved you. You know that. It was a lie." I felt it in my bones, a deep cellular certainty. He would have written to me. He would have found a way. The lie hung in the air between us, ugly and transparent. From that moment on, I started watching her. I saw the way she would end hushed phone calls when I entered a room. I saw her meeting with her brother, Richard, a slick corporate lawyer with shark-like eyes, their heads bent together over stacks of documents at the dining room table. They would stop talking the second they saw me, smiling those tight, insincere smiles. They were closing ranks, building a wall around my father's legacy, and I was on the outside. The suspicion in my gut began to curdle into a cold, hard knot of dread. I wasn't just grieving my father anymore. I was realizing he had been taken from me long before his heart gave out, and the person responsible was pouring me a cup of tea, asking if I was getting enough sleep. The house was no longer a home. It was a crime scene, and I was the only one who seemed to know it. I became determined to find what she was hiding. I didn't know what it was, but I knew with every fiber of my being that it was in that locked desk drawer. My first attempt to get into his office was clumsy. I waited until she left for a spa appointment to de-stress, then tried the handle. Locked. I searched for a spare key in all the usual spots. The ceramic bowl on the entryway table, the hook in the kitchen, the small dish on his bedside table. Nothing. She had taken it. The systematic erasure was terrifying. It wasn't just about locking a door. It was about erasing my access to him. That afternoon, I was sorting through some old boxes of my things in the attic, a pointless task to keep my hands busy, when I found a small, velvet-lined box. Inside were old mementos from my high school years, a dried corsage, a movie ticket stub, and a small, ornate brass key. I almost dismissed it, but then a memory flickered. My dad, years ago, showing me the antique desk he'd bought. "Every secret needs a secret key, kiddo," he'd said with a wink, pressing it into my palm. "This one's for emergencies." It was the key to his desk. All of it. Not just the main lock, but the small, private drawers inside. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. My chance came late that night. Brenda took a sleeping pill. She'd made a great show of telling me how she simply couldn't quiet her mind. And I heard the soft click of her bedroom door closing. The house fell into a deep, oppressive silence, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting. With the small brass key clutched in my sweaty palm, I crept down the hallway. Each floorboard seemed to groan in protest. The door to his office was still locked, but I had another key on my ring, an old skeleton key for the interior doors that I'd never returned after I moved out. It slid into the lock with a rusty scrape and turned with a loud, definitive clunk. I froze, listening. Nothing. Just the muffled hum of San Francisco traffic far below. Inside, the room was cold and smelled of him. Old paper, leather, and a faint hint of the pipe tobacco he used to smoke. I didn't turn on the lights, using only the flashlight from my phone. I moved to the desk, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit the small brass key into the lock of the top right drawer. It turned smoothly, silently. I pulled it open. It was filled with mundane things, stationery, old pens, paper clips. My heart sank. Was I wrong? Then I remembered. He'd said it opened all of them. There was a second, smaller, almost hidden drawer inside the first one, set deep in the back. A false compartment. My fingers fumbled for a moment before finding a small indentation. I pressed it, and a section of the drawer clicked open. And there it was. A single, thick, cream-colored envelope. My name, Chloe, was written on the front in his familiar, elegant script. My breath hitched. I knew, even before I opened it, that this was it. This was what she had lied about. This was what she was so desperate to hide. I carefully lifted it out. It was heavy, sealed with a wax stamp of the Vance family crest, something he only used for the most important documents. I sank into his leather chair, the one that still held the faint impression of his body, and with trembling fingers I broke the seal. The letter was several pages long, written on his personal letterhead. The date at the top was from 6 months ago. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a deathbed note. This was a warning. "My dearest Chloe," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and that I failed to protect you from the situation I have allowed to fester in my own home. I am writing this not as a farewell, but as an apology and a guide. I am so sorry. I have made a terrible mistake, and her name is Brenda." The words leaped off the page, each one a small explosion in the silent room. He wrote about how her charm had slowly curdled into control, how she had systematically isolated him, managing his finances, his schedule, his relationships. He confessed that he'd felt weak, tired, and had let her take over, telling himself it was easier that way. But then he had discovered the truth. He detailed how he'd found discrepancies in their accounts. Small amounts at first, then larger sums, funneled into a private account in her name, an account linked to her brother, Richard. She was bleeding him dry, preparing to leave him, but his sudden diagnosis of a heart condition had changed her plans. A messy divorce would yield less than a grieving widow's inheritance. He had started gathering evidence, making copies of bank statements, offshore transfers, and even printed emails between Brenda and Richard outlining their strategy. He wrote of his shame, his embarrassment at being so thoroughly duped. He had confronted her, and she had turned on him, her mask of civility dropping to reveal a terrifying, venomous greed. She'd threatened to paint him as senile, to use his health against him, to ensure no one would believe him. He knew he was trapped. The letter then gave me a set of instructions, clear and precise. It listed the name of a bank, a safe deposit box number, and a code phrase. "Everything you need to prove what I've written is in that box, Chloe. The original documents. My real will, the one that leaves everything to you, with a trust to ensure you are always cared for. Not the fraudulent one she and her brother undoubtedly drafted and had me sign under duress." The final paragraph shattered what was left of my heart. "I know this is a terrible burden to place on you. My only hope is that this letter finds you, and that you have the strength to see this through. She will not expect it. She thinks she has won. Do not let her erase me. Do not let her have what is ours. Be smart. Be brave. I love you more than words can say. Dad." I sat there in the dark, the pages shaking in my hand, tears streaming down my face. It wasn't just a letter, it was a weapon. A map. A final, desperate plea from a man who knew he was being buried alive. The grief I felt was now fused with a white-hot rage that burned away my tears and left behind a core of pure, unyielding steel. She hadn't just hidden a letter. She had tried to steal my father's last words, his truth, his entire legacy. She was dancing on his grave, and I was about to show her that the dead do, in fact, speak. And their words would bring her world crashing down around her. The first step was that safe deposit box. The bank was a private, old money institution in the financial district, the kind of place with polished brass and hushed tones. The key, my dad wrote, was hidden in the spine of his favorite book, a first edition of Moby Dick. The next morning, I feigned a migraine and stayed in my room until Brenda and Richard left for a meeting with the caterer for the funeral reception. The moment their car pulled away, I was back in his office. I found the book, and sure enough, a small, flat key was taped inside the back cover. I felt a surge of triumph. He had trusted me to be clever enough to find this. He had trusted me. The bank was even more imposing in person. I walked in, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I gave the clerk my father's name and the box number. She looked at me over her spectacles. "Access to this box is restricted. Only Robert Vance or the designated secondary can open it." My blood went cold. "I am the designated secondary." I lied, my voice sounding surprisingly steady. "My name is Chloe Vance." She typed something into her computer, her brow furrowed. The silence stretched for an eternity. I was sure she was about to call security. Then her expression softened. "Ah, yes. I see it here. And the code phrase." I took a deep breath and recited the words from the letter, a line from an old poem my dad used to read to me. The tide rises, the tide falls. The clerk nodded, a small smile touching her lips. Very good. Right this way, Miss Vance. She led me into a vault that looked like something out of a movie, all gleaming steel and silent security. She unlocked the box and slid out a long metal container, leaving me alone in a small, private viewing room. My hands were shaking again as I lifted the lid. It was all there. Stacks of bank statements with highlighted transfers. Printed emails between Brenda and Richard that were so callous, so nakedly greedy. They made me sick. There was a thick legal document bound in blue. I opened it. The last will and testament of Robert Vance. It was dated just 2 months ago. It named me as the sole executor and primary beneficiary of his entire estate. It disinherited Brenda completely, citing irrefutable evidence of financial malfeasance and marital infidelity. He even included a handwritten addendum detailing the emotional abuse and duress she had put him under. And tucked at the bottom of the box was a small velvet pouch. Inside was my mother's engagement ring, the one Brenda had always claimed was lost during a renovation. I sat there for almost an hour, absorbing the sheer scale of her betrayal and the meticulous brilliance of my father's final act of defiance. He had armed me. He had given me everything I needed. When I walked out of that bank, the sun felt brighter, the air crisper. The grief was still there, a heavy cloak on my shoulders, but now it was joined by something else. Purpose. A cold, clear sense of mission. Brenda and Richard were planning a grand, ostentatious funeral at Grace Cathedral. A final performance to solidify her position as the grieving, wealthy widow. They had no idea I was coming armed. They had no idea the star eulogist was about to read from a script they never knew existed. Over the next 2 days, I barely spoke. I let Brenda and her brother bustle around me, making their plans, their voices a low, conspiratorial hum. They treated me with a cloying, condescending sympathy that made my skin crawl. "Chloe, darling, are you sure you're up to this?" Brenda would ask, touching my arm. "It's all so overwhelming." Richard would nod, his eyes full of false concern. "We're handling everything, Chloe. Don't you worry about a thing." Oh, I wasn't worried. I was waiting. I called the one person my dad had mentioned in his letter as someone he still trusted implicitly. Arthur Kensington, his old college roommate and a retired, but famously tenacious trial lawyer. I met him at a quiet cafe in North Beach. I didn't even have to say much. I just pushed the letter and a copy of the new will across the table. Arthur read them, his expression hardening from compassionate concern to stony fury. When he was done, he looked up at me, his eyes sharp. "Your father was a good man. A brilliant man. And they did this to him." He folded the papers deliberately. "The legal side of this will be a slaughter. We'll file to have this new will probated and invalidate the fraudulent one. We'll file civil charges for fraud and theft. We'll ruin them. But," he said, leaning forward, "the public side of this, the funeral, that's your stage, Chloe. What do you want to do?" I looked at him, the plan solidifying in my mind, cold and perfect. "They want a performance," I said, my voice low and steady. "I'm going to give them one." He nodded slowly, a grim smile on his face. "Good girl. Let's prepare you for your debut." The day of the funeral was classic San Francisco. A sharp, brilliant sun fighting against a low-lying fog that clung to the hills. Grace Cathedral was packed. My father had been a well-respected architect, a pillar of the community, and everyone was there to pay their respects. I sat in the front row, a black dress, a simple string of pearls. I was the image of the dutiful, grieving daughter. Across from me, Brenda was holding court, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, accepting condolences with a pained, noble expression. Richard stood beside her, a protective, solemn sentinel. They were so confident, so smug. They looked at me with pity, seeing a broken little girl, not the executor of their downfall. The service was beautiful and hollow. People spoke of my father's generosity, his architectural genius, his laugh. It all felt like a prologue. Then it was Brenda's turn. She glided to the lectern, a vision of tragic elegance. She spoke of my beloved Robert, their whirlwind romance, the profound emptiness of her life now. It was a masterpiece of fiction, and half the congregation was weeping. She finished to a somber, respectful silence and returned to her seat, casting a quick, triumphant glance at her brother. Then the officiant looked at me. And now a few words from his daughter, Chloe. I felt 100 pairs of eyes turn to me. I could feel Brenda's surprise. I hadn't told her I planned to speak. I saw a flicker of annoyance in her eyes, quickly masked. She probably assumed I'd stammer out a few tearful memories. I walked to the lectern, my heels clicking on the cold stone floor. The thick, cream-colored envelope was in my hand. I placed it on the marble surface. My heart was calm. The rage had cooled into something focused and precise. I started softly, my voice clear and strong in the cavernous space. My father, Robert Vance, was a man who believed in structure. In blueprints. He believed that a strong foundation was everything, whether you were building a skyscraper or a life. He also believed in the power of words. He wrote to me on every important occasion of my life. A letter on my first day of school, on my graduation, on the day I opened my own business. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the pews, settling for a moment on Brenda. Her polite smile was starting to look a little strained. So, you can imagine my heartbreak when my stepmother, Brenda, told me that he had left no final letter for me. That he had left this world without a final goodbye. She told me she had looked everywhere, and there was nothing. A murmur went through the crowd. I saw Richard lean in and whisper something to Brenda. I ignored them. But she was mistaken, I said, my voice gaining strength. Or perhaps she simply misplaced it. Because my father did write me one last letter. And I have it right here. I picked up the envelope, my fingers tracing his handwriting. He left it for me where he knew only I would find it. And I believe he would want me to share some of it with all of you, the people he respected and loved. Brenda shot to her feet. Chloe, this is not the time or the place. Her voice was a harsh whisper that carried through the silent cathedral. Richard was right behind her, his face thunderous. This is a private family matter. Please sit down, I said, my voice ringing with an authority I didn't know I possessed. You wouldn't want to cause a scene at my father's funeral, would you? They froze, caught. To interfere would be a confession. They slowly sank back into their seats, their faces ashen. I unfolded the letter. The air was electric. My dearest Chloe, I began, reading my father's words into the microphone. If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and that I failed to protect you from the situation I have allowed to fester in my own home. I read on, my voice never wavering. I read the part about Brenda's calculated isolation. I read the part about the discovery of her financial betrayal, the millions of dollars funneled into offshore accounts with her brother's help. Gasps rippled through the pews. Business associates of my father were staring at Brenda and Richard, their expressions shifting from sympathy to shock and disgust. I kept going. I read the paragraph about the fraudulent will she had him sign under duress, when he was sick and vulnerable. She thought my illness was her opportunity. I read my father's words echoing off the stone walls. She turned my home into a prison, and my love into a balance sheet. Brenda was no longer composed. Her face was a grotesque mess of rage and panic. She was shaking her head, mouthing the word lies. Richard looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. I saved the most powerful part for last. I read the section where my dad named Arthur Kensington as his trusted counsel and detailed the location of the safe deposit box containing the Real will and all the evidence. As I said Arthur's name, he stood up from his seat in the third row, a silent, grim confirmation for all to see. And finally, I said, my voice softening as I reached the end of the letter, my own tears finally starting to well. He wrote this. Do not let her erase me. Do not let her have what is ours. Be smart. Be brave. I love you more than words can say. Dad! I folded the letter. The silence in the cathedral was absolute, profound. It was the silence of a truth so undeniable it sucked all the air out of the room. I looked directly at Brenda. Her mask was gone. In its place was the raw, ugly face of a thief caught in the act. This, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, but carrying with deadly clarity, is my father's blueprint. His foundation. His final words. You did not misplace them, Brenda. You hid them. You tried to bury my father's truth along with his body. But as he always taught me, a structure built on lies will always eventually collapse. I turned and walked away from the lectern, down the aisle, past the stunned faces of the mourners. I didn't look back. I could hear the eruption of whispers, the frantic movements as people turned to stare at the front pew. I walked out of the heavy oak doors into the bright, foggy San Francisco day, leaving the wreckage of Brenda's life imploding behind me in the house of God. The war wasn't over, but the decisive battle had just been won. The aftermath was as swift and brutal as Arthur had predicted. The public humiliation at the funeral was a firestorm. My father's oldest friends and most powerful business partners, men and women who valued loyalty and integrity above all else, immediately sided with me. They had seen the truth with their own eyes, heard it in my father's own words. Brenda and Richard were social pariahs before they even left the cathedral. The legal proceedings were a mere formality. Arthur filed the petition to probate the real will the very next morning. Faced with the mountain of evidence from the safe deposit box and the testimony of dozens of influential witnesses from the funeral, Brenda and Richard's lawyers advised them to fold. Contesting it would have led to criminal charges for fraud, perjury, and elder exploitation. They settled. Brenda was forced to relinquish any claim to the estate. She had to repay every dollar she had siphoned away, which, after Arthur's forensic accountants were done, amounted to a figure that would bankrupt her 10 times over. The Pacific Heights mansion was mine. The art she had so carefully curated was sold off to pay her debts. Richard was disbarred for his role in drafting a fraudulent will under coercive circumstances. Their beautifully constructed world, built on my father's money and my family's name, had been demolished in a single afternoon. I never saw Brenda again. I heard she moved back to whatever small, miserable town she had clawed her way out of, stripped of her wealth, her reputation, and her entire identity. She had become a ghost, which seemed fitting. I spent the next year rebuilding. Not just the estate, but my own life. I moved back into my childhood home, and room by room, I exorcised her presence. I threw out the cold, modern furniture she'd bought, the soulless art she'd hung on the walls. I brought my father back into the house, filling it with his books, his photos, his memory. I found a new sense of peace in his office, sitting in his old leather chair, looking out over the city he helped build. I ran my business. I reconnected with the old family friends Brenda had pushed away, and I learned to live with the hollow ache his absence had left behind. The rage was gone, replaced by a quiet, somber victory. I had honored his last wish. I had protected his legacy. Sometimes, late at night, when the fog rolls in and blankets the city in a thick, quiet shroud, I take out his last letter. I don't read the parts about Brenda anymore. I just read the beginning and the end. My dearest Chloe, and I love you more than words can say. It's a reminder that the story wasn't really about her, or the money, or the revenge. It was about a father's love for his daughter, and the extraordinary lengths he would go to, even from beyond the grave, to protect her. He had taught me how to build things, but in the end, his final lesson was how to burn something to the ground. The end.